This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Andrew Biswell explores the strange dystopia of The Old Men at the Zoo by Angus Wilson, with writer and academic Marina MacKay. The Old Men at the Zoo is a novel of two halves. In the first, Simon Carter, Secretary of London Zoo, is tempted by responsibility and power, and forgoes his gifts as a naturalist. Yet in their desire to set up a reserve for wild animals, the old men at the zoo are blind to the approaching chaos of nuclear war. In the second half, the zoo is overtaken by a dystopian dictatorship and transformed into a concentration camp. Angus Wilson was born in 1913. During the Second World War, he worked as a code breaker at Bletchley Park, after which he worked as a librarian in the British Museum's Department of Printed Books. His first novel, Hemlock and After, was published in 1952 and was followed by 7 more, including Late Call, which also appears on Anthony Burgess's list. From 1966 to 1978, he was Professor of English at the University of East Anglia, where he co-founded, with Malcolm Bradbury, the famous Masters in Creative Writing. He was knighted in 1980 and died in 1991. Marina MacKay is Professor of English Literature and a Fellow of St Peter's College, University of Oxford. Her books include Modernism, War and Violence, and Ian Watt, the novel and wartime critic. She's currently writing a book about British literature and culture in the 1950s. For all the relevant links, head to the description of this episode, where you'll also find a list of all the books mentioned. Here's Andrew Biswell, who spoke to Marina MacKay about The Old Men at the Zoo by Angus Wilson in September 2025.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Marina. First of all, I wonder if I can ask you, what was your first encounter with Angus Wilson's writing, and what did you think of it when you first came to it, and maybe how did those opinions change later on as you got to know the work better?
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew. It's a pleasure. It's an unusual pleasure to be talking about Angus Wilson, of all people. So I first encountered Angus Wilson via Anglo-Saxon Attitudes when I was in my late teens. And then I read all of them in no particular order that I can remember. And then I ended up writing my PhD on Angus Wilson, which was a catastrophically stupid mistake, because what I was responding to in Wilson in my early 20s was that sort of strange tone he has, novels of conscience that are actually kind of a bit histrionic and often fairly camp. But it meant that I was, I suppose, reading in a kind of semi-formalist way. And all the critics at the time that I read were saying, oh, Angus Wilson, he's wonderful for how we live now and all the rest of it. And I'm thinking they're damning him with faint praise. That's the most you can say about Angus Wilson, that, he's a sort of sociological kind of writer. And then increasingly I realised that, it's not faint praise, it's exactly right. So when I came back to Angus Wilson, to Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, in fact, a couple of years ago, with what I know now about mid-century culture, I'm like, this is a wonderful case study in the sort of structures of feeling of that time. So essentially, falling on my sword, I was wrong when I first read. We're right, which is no way to actually write a PhD thesis.
Maybe to approach this particular novel, The Old Men at the Zoo, could you, I know it's a huge ask, try to sum it up for a reader who's maybe coming to the book for the first time, who doesn't necessarily know what happens or what it's like or the texture of the writing?
Well, that would be a good example of a novel about the private conscience that's also got a kind of histrionic and theatrical dimension. It's published in 1961. It's set about a decade in the future. It's narrated by a senior administrator at the London Zoo. And the short version is he's a very, very good, conscientious administrator. But he's so conscientious and administrator of this major national institution that he's so inward focused on the problems of the institution that he doesn't realize that there's something coming down the line that is going to make national institutions like his and their sort of micro dilemmas completely irrelevant. So essentially, there's a war coming and an occupation coming. And he has to deal with that in the later stages of the novel.
Simon Carter, who's narrating the story, he's also got these difficulties with his wife and with his colleagues. And it kind of leads me on to the next question, that it seems to me, actually reading the book for the first time, as I have been recently, it's a novel about organizations, but also, much more interestingly, it's about power structures, different ways of using and abusing power. And also, I'm intrigued by the title, The Old Men at the Zoo. The title suggests these conflicts between generations as well. But I wondered how far that corresponded with your own sense of the book, or are there other things here that you think are more important, maybe?
Just doubling back, the thing I missed is one of the things I missed is one of the things you added, the fact that there's a kind of family in the background to all of this. And as far as power is concerned, there's an interesting story there. It's not the most interesting story in the book, but his wife is essentially holding the purse strings in that household. She's a very well-off part American. It's her riches that allow him to take this sort of not particularly well-salaried job at the zoo. She's the one kind of calling the shots in that household. The question of power and organization, one of the many, many things I didn't know about the mid-century when I was writing that PhD was that it was a period much preoccupied in the novel by institutional questions, state of the nation questions. So one of the books, in fact 11 books on Burgess's 99 novels, the C.P. Snow's Strangers and Brothers series. And these are all set in institutions like a Cambridge college, a Whitehall department. So you can very much see where the Old Men at the Zoo is kind of coming from that point of view. C.P. Snow's novels are like this one, narrated by a kind of worldly wise, experienced administrator and, man of affairs and all the rest of it. And to some degree, I wonder if the Old Men at the Zoo is partly, but only partly, taking the mickey out of this. Because I think actually Wilson did want to write one of these institutional novels about organization, power, as you were saying. There's an essay by him called is it Diversity and Depth from 1958, so more or less contemporary with this novel, where he's talking about how the Victorian novelists had the great advantage over modern novelists in that they were read by men and women of affairs, people in public life, people in parliament, people in the law. And he writes about this kind of enviously, that this isn't true for us. And you feel kind of longing that he wants to be right. He wants to live in a time where it was possible for the novel to have genuine influence on the influencers, right? Not just, the people, but men and women of affairs is the phrase that he uses. So yes, it's about organisation, it's about power, and in that sense, it's kind of, of its sort of C.P. Snow type moment. But you can't really get away from the fact that, it is full of like really cracker stuff, like, like literal bestiality. Weird kind of gladiatorial executions of your political enemies, stuff like that you're not going to find in a C.P. Snow novel. But yeah, I think he did want to try his hand at the novel of public affairs for sure.
Burgess, there's an essay about Mrs. Thatcher, 10 years of the Thatcher decade, it's called, and he's complaining about a similar thing. He says Mrs. Thatcher doesn't read fiction. The only novel that she ever owned up to reading was The Fourth Protocol by Frederick Forsyth, which she liked so much that she read it twice. And that's it. That was, as far as we know, the sum total of her engagement with contemporary fiction. So it's a kind of different world from the world that Wilson's describing.
Sure, but in the interest of political balance, Andrew, we might wish to point out that Sir Keir Starmer is not apparently much of a reader either. His Desert Island Disc book being, a sort of great big atlas. So we live in a different world again. He's not even reading Frederick Forsyth.
Right. Well, we're almost talking about a different planet, aren't we? But anyway, we can come back to that, the kind of resonance and relevance maybe. Now, Wilson, in an interview slightly later, 1972 interview, he says The Old Men at the Zoo is probably his favourite novel. And he talks about why. He says because it took what he knew about the evil and savagery and horrors of fascism and the Nazis and then projected that knowledge onto an imaginary situation in the near future. So I wanted to ask, how far do you think of this as a novel about the past? We're now separated from it by 60 years, or is it, as Wilson's thinking about it, a novel about the future, or is it about his present? I mean, whereabouts would you situate it there?
Evelyn Waugh thought it was a novel about the past. He thought it was about the period 1938 to 42. So he goes to the bother of writing into the Spectator after John Mortimer reviews it and says, actually, I don't want that review, Mortimer's review, to put people off what's actually a really interesting book. So here's what I think it's about. And that's what he thinks it's about. He thinks it's about the fears attendant on the approach of Nazism. And I think that's where the old men are coming from. I think they're the same old men as in, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. Let me not hear the wisdom of old men. And they're the guilty men, right, of 1940, the men denounced by Michael Foot and others for appeasement. None of these people can see what's coming, and they should be able to see what's coming, and they're absolutely oblivious to it. Yeah, I think Bob's probably right. He's taking what he remembers of that period and projecting a war, along those lines. Because there's quite a lot in it about, this is a sort of, nuclear age, but everybody's going to go conventional in terms of warfare. I think as far as the evil of Nazism is concerned, as you'll know, Wilson was really interested in the question of evil and its representation, as well he might have been given the period in which he was writing. He's got a very good essay, I think was originally Electric Evil in the English Novel, which I recommend, absolutely wholeheartedly in that. So that's 1967. And your listeners, even if they're not associated with the universe, I think they can just call it up by Googling it. It's talking about the way in which the English novel is really good on questions of right and wrong, but really poor on questions of good and evil. And he goes all the way back to Richardson, and he's got really shrewd and clever things to say about all sorts of canonical rights, Richardson and Defoe and Austen and so on, all the way through to people like Golding. He says in that essay that the Old Men at the Zoo was his effort to find a kind of objective correlative or whatever for evil, and he talks about a man who has devoted his life to a particular species of wildlife, the badgers, and then he has to kill them for food. And he says, well, that wasn't a bad job of representing evil. I don't think the badgers can bear the weight, but I don't know if any novel is adequate to what actually happened in Wilson's time. A sober historian's account of a massacre, in Eastern Europe in 1943 is evil. It's very hard to do that, do anything in a novel that's going to, sum up the nature of the crimes that were committed at that time. I think he's right about, trying to write something that's adequate to the evils of the 1940s, but I think he underestimates actually how incredibly difficult it would be to do it.
Wilson also says, in relation to this book, that he wanted to address questions of Englishness and English values. And maybe you can tell us how you think those themes are playing out in this particular novel.
Yeah, that's such a great question. The novel opens with a kind of black swan event. A young zookeeper is killed by not one of the dangerous animals in the zoo. He's killed by a giraffe, Smokey, of all things. And he dies Smokey has kicked him in the balls. So it's an unexpected event. What does Simon Carter, the narrator, do? He's like, we must have an inquiry. Lessons must be learned. And that seems to me incredibly British public life-ish. I mean, the one thing that's changed now is that if something like that happened, it would be your like regulatory body that forced you to have an inquiry about it. But that's Carter's first impulse. What happened? How can we stop it from happening again? And this is in the context of something, obviously preposterously improbable happening. So I think the novel's really good on the proceduralist quality of British life. I think its most brutal critique of English attitudes is in the way nobody takes seriously what should be really obvious to them, the coming war. So British people always think of war as something that happens to somebody else, that it's impossible for the British ever to be defeated and occupied, as happens in this novel. The British have a very, very, very thin, and this isn't a sort of Remainer or Brexit point, they have a very, very thin idea of Europe, which is obviously part of the story here. It's about a European invasion. It's about the fascists being uni-Europeans, which tells you something about the contingency of vibes politics, right? That being a Remainer now is kind of progressively shaded. Whereas, of course, being pro-Europe could mean you were extremely right-wing, in the late 50s and early 60s. This, in case it's not obvious, is set against the background of the Treaty of Rome. It's not mentioned, but it probably wouldn't have to be mentioned. It would have been so obvious to its first readers. That establishes the European Economic Community, and Britain applies and gets rejected in 1960. So there's a huge debate going on in the late 50s about whether Britain should join Europe or not. And I think the novel is very shrewd on how two world wars haven't given us two world wars, and I suppose I would add our entry into and exit from Europe, haven't given us a reason to depart from our kind of natural sort of island exceptionalism that, what these people are doing isn't really anything to do with us. I don't know if that answers the question about Englishness, but I think there's something about exceptionalism and Europe and war, and it could never happen here, built into the novel.
One of the other things that Wilson says, I think from another interview, he's talking about Simon Carter, and he says he's a man almost destroyed by his need to be a neat administrator, a civilized and civilizing man. But he's also, within the character, he's got this passionate feeling for wildlife. And I wonder how important is that opposition, that tension between the desire to be wild and free, maybe not just here, in other Wilson novels as well, and this opposing desire to be civilized. Is that something that's important either here or in the other books?
Yeah, I think it's important here. I think it's probably more important in some of the others because there's so much about the cost of a certain kind of wildness. So he says somewhere, Wilson, that his generation was dominated by the twin determinisms of Marx and Freud. I don't think there's much Marx in his books, but I think there's a lot of Freud. I think there's very much that sense of civilization is a very, very thin crust over the abyss. I suppose that it's very obvious in Anglo-Saxon attitudes that these nice civilized English people are just completely unable to deal with committed Nazis. They have no idea what they're dealing with. One of the main characters, dead by the time the book opens, is a crypto-fascist who manages to create ramifications like 40 years down the line because nobody wanted to take on what it was that he meant to that culture. And he talks somewhere about an imagining of the world's kind of, thin ice, that he walks on thin ice and he fears always that the ice is going to break. That's a very, very Freudian sort of civilization and its discontents way of thinking about the world. So I've sort of avoided talking about the old men at the zoo in this context because I just don't really buy the badger thing. I think it's being asked to carry far too much. It's a problem of narration, I think, predominantly, that because it's unusually for Wilson, it's in the first person, and Simon Carter has to make all sorts of declarations about himself. I am passionate about my children. I am devoted to my wife. I love badgers. So I don't find it entirely convincing for that reason. It's a sort of old thing of, sort of telling rather than showing. It's also something inherent to the badgers themselves. I don't think they're powerful enough as a as a symbol of the wild and free. Maybe that's the problem of him being, a British naturalist. Badgers, TB aside, aren't much of a threat to anyone. Like, it's really hard to it's hard to see them as a symbol of the uninhibited id or whatever.
We could indulge in spoilers, and you mentioned already the zoo as a source of food, and that's part of the kind of anarchic, very dark, but it's still fun. It's grotesque. Those sections of the book dealing with the people who are interested in the animals, the people who are cataloguing them, taxonomizing them, and keeping them. That's one strain of it, but the animal kingdom is also something that he's interested in for the purposes of his fiction. Though the institution I kept thinking about was the British Library, knowing that he'd worked there, thinking about the kind of cataloguing and taxonomizing. And I kept wondering whether this zoo is sort of standing in for what Angus Wilson knew about the British Library.
Well, I mean, does it have to be a zoo is the question. Could it be something else? It's true that animals are important to Wilson. There's very much a tendency to see cruelty to animals as a symbol of evil. In another novel, actually the one right before this, The Middle Age of Mrs. Elliot, a gay man is dying prematurely and he wants his animals gassed so that they don't survive him. And it's very hard to shake off the sense that this is really about his narcissism. He's basically a good guy, but his inability to conceive of his animals as separate from himself, or a kind of psychological weakness. That's something we haven't talked about at all. Sorry, I'm mentioning the one of the main characters in The Middle Age of Mrs. Elliot is her gay brother. Wilson himself was gay, and I think that outspokenness about that may have had some consequences for his reputation at that particular time.
Maybe that's more prominent in other novels, because we should say that when it came out, Anthony Burgess was almost the only person who really liked this novel, and a lot of people were less sympathetic to it. And as I understand it, it didn't necessarily sell that well. And though Wilson's clearly invested a great deal in it, it seems to me from reading about him that he was always a bit disappointed that people in Britain at least didn't sort of get it in the way that he'd hoped they would. There was a review which I think stung him very badly by V.S. Pritchard, I think, who said that it was preposterous, the idea that the zoo animals could be pitted in gladiatorial combat against political dissidents. He wasn't buying any of that. And yet it seems to me legitimate within the form. It's a kind of weird, kind of quite comic, futuristic dystopia. And I did wonder if Pritchett wasn't unfair in kind of wanting it to be a different kind of book, not understanding the genre that he was working in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in a way, Wilson would be vindicated in what he says in Evil in the English Novel about British people having a thin sense of cruelty and what's actually possible. The kind of it couldn't happen here. The sort of like that famous passage in Northanger Abbey where it's like, "Dear Miss Morland, what are you thinking?" when Catherine Morland, thinks that Henry Tilney's father's locked up his wife and kept her a prisoner. It's not that it couldn't happen, but it's that it couldn't happen in England, right? But there's something fantastically naive about thinking, that the puppet government of a fascist power wouldn't be phenomenally cruel. Tell the Hungarians, it couldn't happen here. These puppet regimes, like the Arrow Cross, were fearsomely cruel. So the sort of, the English aren't like that. That's a European problem. That just seems catastrophically stupid or complacent, which of course is what the book's about. It's about complacency.
Wilson also said that he wanted his novels to have a theatrical flair that he associated with Dickens, who's obviously one of his really important precursors. And he speaks about the capacity to endow the stage with scenery, to give movement across both the main opera and the little ballet. A very interesting series of metaphors there, it seems to be. But how far does that help us to understand the effects he's aiming for in a novel like this idea of the theatrical flair?
Well, I mean, there's something a bit meta about its handling in The Old Men at the Zoo, because it's built around, in part, the celebrations of British Day, which I suppose must be based on Empire Day, which turns into Commonwealth Day in 1958. So again, this kind of thing would have been in the air. So one of the characters wants to reinstate the charisma of the old-fashioned Victorian zoo. He organises a British Day, and then because of the coming war, he lets off his fireworks and his music early. And you've got this wonderful theatrical scene, a good old, rare old Armageddon, it's called in the book. And it's very funny, very theatrical. But the theatre has been produced by one of the characters in the book and is then being kind of replicated in the book. As far as Wilson and Dickens are concerned, Anglo-Saxon Attitudes is the most Dickensian of the lot. You've got the main plot, then you've got all these subplots, and then as in Bleak House or A Mutual Friend, you're like, well, what do all these people have in common with each other? And it all ties up superbly at the end. But I guess that's not theatrical Dickens. It's sort of structural Dickens, the idea of the novel as a model for society, where you might not know how you're connected to other people, but you definitely are.
On a very basic level, it's also a novel that's got quite a large cast of characters, so much so that you have to read or refer back to the list of dramatis personae at the beginning of the book, which I found quite helpful, actually. Just think, oh, hang on, how are they connected? What's their job? And, what's their partner called? These kinds of questions. And something about the scope of 19th century novels that is maybe part of what this one's also aiming at. It's also, I think importantly, quite an open-ended novel. It takes care not to give us too much resolution when we come to the end. So, for example, here, it's not clear what the future is going to hold for Simon. Is he going to become the secretary of the zoo? Is his marriage going to survive? And he's not really sure about any of this. We're not sure either. And I wanted to ask you whether that sense of open-endedness is typical of Angus Wilson's novels.
Yeah, definitely. But it's usually much more hopeful. I mean, I think it goes to the narrative point of view issue that this is his one experiment in first-person narration. And there are questions about how straight you're supposed to read Simon Carter. I think we're supposed to read him straight. And I think somebody said of Brideshead Revisited that, I don't think it was Burns, I think it was Bernard Bergonzi, that it would be a better novel if there were a sense that the first-person narrator's perceptions weren't to be taken at face value. So normally at the end of a Wilson novel, or the novels prior to this, it's open-ended, but there's a sense of emancipation, a sense of the main character having been kind of liberated from the thing that's been burdening them in the course of the novel, and in some cases, like Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, like 40 years prior as well. Here you have Simon Carter saying, I'm looking forward to this new world. And he says something to the effect of, because I shall always be connected to the old. And I'm thinking, oh, hang on. He's very nearly a collaborator in the course of the book. He's only just kind of got into the resistance in time. I suppose that's the problem of being the good administrator. It's a very mid-century question, like what are your obligations to doing your job versus the morality of the job that you're actually doing. So I see it as maybe a bit bleaker than I think perhaps Wilson wants us to see it as. He's so saturated, Simon Carter, in the world that made the war and the occupation possible, that I find it really hard to take the kind of usual emancipating, open-ended, here's to the future. I find it hard to take that as seriously as I would, or to see it as unproblematic as I would in the earlier novels. There's the marriage plot as well. He and his wife are temporarily reconciled, but his wife is dreadful. You think, why does he want, like he keeps telling us how much he loves Martha, and you're thinking, why? She's this really sanctimonious and chauvinistic American. I don't think she reflects Wilson's views of Americans. I think she's not actually meant to be a particularly attractive person. Like, why doesn't he just cut that marriage loose? Let her go. So the reconciliation is sort of supposed to be a good thing. You're like, I don't know that it is. But that's a first-person narration problem. It's a narrator who you really feel would have been better as an unreliable narrator. If Wilson had kind of gone all in on that.
I wanted to ask you about the reception of the book. When it came out in 1961, Anthony Burgess, reviewing it in the Yorkshire Post, where he was the regular fiction critic, he was very enthusiastic about it. And he comes back to the novel in a book called The Novel Now, which is a student's guide to contemporary fiction published in 1967. And this is the one he gets really excited about. He says, "The Old Man at the Zoo, to me, it seems the best thing that Wilson's ever done." And he also says, you can see what he's excited about. With the coming of the war, the zoo collapses and Wilson's naturalism collapses, or if you please, is transfigured into something like mythical fantasy. We're in a world of private nightmare, as Dickens so often was, but Wilson has the un-Dickensian courage to give us the nightmare its head. And he writes about the set pieces in the book, the cannibalistic, he calls, eating of the animals, the gladiatorial proposals of conquering Europe. These are brilliantly rendered. They go far beyond the scope of ordinary fictional plausibility. And unlike V.S. Pritchett, he really enjoyed that and saw the point of it. But we know that not everyone shared that sense that the novel had succeeded. And I wonder how it compared with the reception of other books that Wilson had written through the 50s and the 60s.
So Wilson's short stories are actually kind of more like the Old Men at the Zoo. They have a kind of gothic and spectacular quality, supernatural as well. Obviously, the Old Men at the Zoo doesn't, but that sense of kind of breaking the bounds of realism. But the novels on which his reputation was made are really fairly conservative formally. And I think actually it's in the novel now, isn't it, that Burgess talks about Wilson as a new wine in old bottles kind of writer. I think he might be talking about Anglo-Saxon attitudes there, maybe, but he talks about, Wilson deals with very modern material, but he does it in this extremely traditional form. And, he says that fairly neutrally, I think. But I can see why he responded to the sort of the new bottle of the old Men at the Zoo, even if it was kind of old wine that was put into that. If it's, that sort of historical plot, really, like Evelyn Waugh thought, that it's about 1938 to 1942 and the coming war and the phony war, that would be a kind of, old plot put into a new form.
It's interesting, there's a huge amount of attention paid in the novel now to Wilson, and it's all of the greatest hits, really, that Burgess obviously read and thought very highly of. Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, The Middle Age of Mrs. Eliot. There's a big-ish section on The Old Man and the Zoo, and then Late Call. Again, it gets quite substantial treatment there. And that kind of leads me into what I wanted to ask about Wilson's sort of enduring reputation, because we know that in the 60s and the 70s, he's one of the most famous novelists working in Britain. And he was often invited to sort of speak and pronounce and lecture. And he got his knighthood and he was on TV and he was a really big name in his time. And yet that reputation has fallen off more recently, certainly since his death. Most of his novels have disappeared from sight. And the work, sadly, is not really much on the map. I don't know how widely it's taught or studied. And maybe we could talk a bit more about that, sort of how and why this happens sometimes with writers who are acclaimed in their time and then sort of fade out of view.
I wonder if to some extent there's a broader period point about who's survived from so he starts his career 1949 is his first short story collection. So all these people who started their career late 40s, in the 50s, writing into the 60s, like how many of them have actually survived? How many could you count on people having read who would count as uncontroversially canonical? And it's actually easier to think of people who were important and aren't than say, okay, well, everybody knows who Muriel Spark is. I mean, she would be presumably one example of somebody who lasted, but she had a very, very, very long writing career, into the 2000s. And then there are the usual sort of political issues, the sort of posh white man problem. There's the relative unevenness of his oeuvre, and I don't mean that as a criticism of his body of work, but you've got these sort of fairly conservative novels of conscience at the start, and then he starts getting much more experimental. He's very in tune with the currents of his time, Angus Wilson, and maybe that wasn't such a good thing, because maybe it sort of creates a kind of dispersal of his talent. So you can't say, oh, Angus Wilson stands for whatever, in the way that Barbara Pym, to take a sort of novelist of the 50s, we all know what a Barbara Pym novel's like. We all know what a Graham Greene novel is going to be like. I think maybe that period is a problem, and I think he might be a problem. The sort of coming in and out of print. I think Anglo-Saxon Attitudes is a New York Review classic, or that's the most recent edition I've got. I think it's a Faber find, print on demand. But, it's not that you sort of, I could go around the corner to Blackwell's and pick up an Angus Wilson novel. I couldn't. What do you think it's about, Andrew?
I'm very intrigued by your idea that it could be a mid-century problem. And you mentioned Barbara Pym, who I think towards the end of her life, she was having great difficulty getting novels published. She was still writing them, but people had, they'd sort of gone off. Publishers didn't really want to commit themselves. And it was only when I think a whole load of people, Anthony Powell and Philip Larkin and maybe Kingsley Amis, sort of intervened and started talking her up and sort of writing pieces about her work and persuading publishers to pick up these late Barbara Pym novels. And of course, there are a whole load of other people who, Nigel Belchin, for example, who just sort of fell off a cliff. And yet, he was summoned to Hollywood to write the Cleopatra film for Elizabeth Taylor. Maybe one of his novels is in print now. So maybe there's a whole current of people who, we could be optimistic and say they're waiting to be rediscovered. And maybe that's part of what 99 Novels is trying to do, the book, is to remind people that these really good novels are still around. So which of Angus Wilson's books do you think deserve to be rediscovered? Would you like reprinted?
The one that comes right after The Old Men at the Zoo, I think, deserves a much, much wider audience. The novel Late Call. If sort of uncharitably, I sometimes think that the family plot in The Old Men at the Zoo kind of doesn't come off, the marriage and the two kids and stuff. I'm thinking, well, he's talking about a world that's, just too remote from his own personal life for Wilson to sort of get in. But Late Call is about an elderly working class retired hotel manageress in Newtown in the early 60s. And she couldn't be further from Angus Wilson. And it's an absolute, biographically, and it's an absolutely terrific book. It's one of the most insightful accounts I can think of the lasting effects of growing up working class, which seems a very, very odd thing to praise it for. But when you think about the context of that 1964 book, and you've had this sort of kitchen sink and new wave cinema and angry young men, and this, sort of move towards a sort of sociological kind of realism, you think none of them caught the psychology of class the way Angus Wilson did in that novel. So again, he's responding to something that's in the air. The sort of let's talk about class experience from a working class point of view. But he does it in such an extraordinary way. It's essentially about an old woman trying to come to terms in a completely uneducated and uncultured, unliterary way with her life experience since the turn of the century. Remarkable book. But, once you describe, you think, who wants to read that? It just sounds so unfashionable.
One question we always end with, which is thinking about the list of 99 novels, and if we wanted to top it up to 100, if you were asked to add another novel to Burgess's list of 99, which one would it be and for what reasons?
So he does a cheat in that list that I'm extremely prone to do. When I ask, what's your favourite novel? I say, A Dance to the Music of Time, which is in fact 12 novels, as you know. And I've never managed to convince anybody to read it in any context. And I've been teaching full time since I was about 25. Nope. I'm like, no, you must read this. All my graduate students, no, you must read this. Has anybody ever read it? That's already on your list. All 12 novels passed off as one, as I do. You could put a Barbara Pym novel on. It's quite short on comedy, I thought, his list. That's why I was so pleased to see Anthony Paul on there. I think the book I would put on, because it's a book I would love to see come back, is D.M. Thomas's The White Hotel from 1981. It's one of those novels that caused a splash when it came out. So it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize the year that Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, very deservedly, of course, won it. And it's one of those novels that would show up as a kind of curiosity in surveys of post-war or contemporary British fiction, through the 90s, and now seems to have disappeared. It's one of the bravest post-war British books I can think of. It's barely like a British novel at all. It's a fictional patient of Freud's who gets caught up ultimately in the Holocaust in Ukraine. Her symptoms that Freud has been trying to treat don't refer to something that has happened to her, but to something that will happen to her. I would say it's nearly unteachable. That hasn't done anything for its reputation, because, of course, with so many books from this period, it matters that you can put them on a syllabus, whereas The White Hotel is erotic, I think, is the sort of, polite way of putting it. It's absolutely filthy, but it's filthy in a sort of, for serious, for very serious, entirely serious reasons, right? Because it's about the history of psychoanalysis. So can't be taught, wouldn't read it on the bus. I would love to know that other people are reading it in the privacy of their own homes. It's astonishing. It's the most European of British novels that I can think of, and I can't think of anything at all like it.
Well, thank you. We're all noting things down. I've been scribbling away as we've been talking, and it's good to know that the list doesn't end with the 99. There's always more to discover. Thank you very much, Marina. That's been great.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Pleasure to talk to you.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Modernism, War and Violence and Ian Watt, The Novel and the Wartime Critic by Marina MacKay are both out now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.